Hey everyone, Gaijin here, and man oh man, I can already hear it in my head. I can already hear people being like, oh, there's Gaijin blindly taking the side of a bunch of xenophobes. Look, the title of this video is not in defense of the Japanese government and its policies. It is in defense of Japan, as in all of it, as in everything has to be considered. Also, apologies for the random footage that's playing in the foreground. I honestly still kind of get nervous with cameras, and I just didn't want to have that compounding my ability to talk in this video, so enjoy, I guess. So, rather than starting off with the expectation of people thinking I'm going to sit here and defend every single one of Japan's decisions, let me actually start off by saying, yes, it actually is really sad to see that the Japanese public polls are so aggressively in favor of keeping their borders closed. Oh, what was it? I think last time I checked it was like 89% of the population is in favor of Kishida's policies of banning foreign arrivals. Trust me, I understand the frustration. I really do. As I mentioned in a previous video, come 2019, I was starting to make strides in possibly finally moving to Japan to expand my career and my content. Now it's 2022 and I don't see our situation changing anytime soon. In my rough estimate, I think it'd be about 2025 before any semblance of normalcy will be returning to allow foreigners back into Japan. I also understand and sympathize with exchange students trying to get into the country. I've studied there myself back in the mid-2000s, and I know the paperwork involved. I understand the frustrations of the bureaucracy that you have to go through just to be in Japan for a simple 4 months to a year. I also cannot for the life of me even begin to understand what it's like to pay on-site tuition for online classes. To me, that is absolutely insane. Equally as insane as students having to live in another Asian country like Korea in order to study Japanese. I'll honestly be surprised if in that time those students don't just decide to change their focus to Korea. But it's gonna be another 5 years to see how that ends up. And lordy, I cannot even imagine the pain in the ass process of getting your paperwork done, waiting for it to process, and then be told you've been denied, having to start and repeat the process 3 to 4 times, with no members of Japanese government giving any clarification of when that might change. I feel for y'all. I really do. And worst of all, I can't even imagine the absolute heart-wrenching pain some of you are going through not being able to see family and loved ones. I've got a friend here who hasn't seen his girlfriend in 2 years and counting. I've also heard stories of multinational families being unable to see each other, and even foreign residents in Japan who are just too scared to leave the country to attend funerals because they don't know if Japan is going to all of a sudden stealthily ban them and not allow them to come back in. Now, at this point, I want to bring up the question of why, because I'm not hearing a lot of analytical talk about that question. A lot of the time it's, well, Japan's racist or Japan is xenophobic, which in my opinion are overly easy, convenient, and generalizing answers that also happen to be very incorrect. So let me throw my 20-year-old experienced hat into the ring here. Japan as a whole has rarely concerned itself outside its own islands, with the majority of the country's developed existence being really inwardly focused. I know that may not make too much sense considering how much cultural borrowing Japan has done and still continues to do, but the difference here is that Japan has spent hundreds of years borrowing from other cultures in order to better itself, not necessarily for the sake of learning about or understanding the cultures that it borrows from. If you want a great example, just look at the popularization and coolification of the English language in Japan. You see English everywhere in advertisements, pop music, media, and etc., but a lot of this cultural appropriation was done for the enjoyment and entertainment of Japan, not because the country is super fascinated with learning English. Any ALTs can tell you exactly how thrilled the Japanese population at large is to learn English, or any other foreign language for that matter. And the same could be said for the Meiji period when Japan was rapidly modernizing. It wasn't doing so because it wanted to understand and make friends with foreign powers. In fact, it was kind of the opposite. Japan saw what happened to China in the First Opium War and decided they needed foreign experts to modernize them so that they could be just as powerful as their would-be colonizers. Heck, this even happened in the Sengoku Jidai Warring States period, one of the times that Japan was the least interested in the outside world as the country was carving itself up into dozens of localized clans and everyone was scrambling to develop domestic power. During this time, there was a figurative and literal explosion in interest in European firearms technology, with Japan not only replicating the firearms that they bought from the West, but also created some truly insane firearms of their own. So insane that, yeah, I would love to actually make a video talking about just them and their development. And again, Japan did not overall care about the history or cultures that these weapons came from. They culturally appropriated this tool of war specifically for their own interests. Look, bottom line, Japan, historically speaking, has a long list of cultural appropriation from other countries of Asia, to other countries of Europe, to other countries of North and South America, to, well, just about everywhere. But rarely was it ever done so for the sake of understanding the cultures that it was borrowing from. Japan's process of cultural appropriation is to take something from another country, change it ever so slightly to make it fit within their own society just right, and then call it their own. Japan has always had an insular mentality when it came to its own well-being. In fact, they actually have a word for it, Shimaguni Konjo, or basically island nation sentiment. The idea that due to being an island nation, little of the country's activity affected the outside world, and little of the outside world affected the island. While this sentiment is true for a number of island nations in the Pacific, Japan is a very, very different case. And I'll explain why. See, this sentiment has sort of evolved into a belief that Japan is a massively unique yet overly complex culture. And because of this, the general population of Japan will be pretty lenient when it comes to outsiders trying to navigate their complicated culture of hierarchy and sociologically structured politeness, and in many, many ways, this is a really good thing. Japan has had a long history and strong reputation for being a very polite and helpful society, even to outsiders. Whether or not people do it out of genuine concern or social pressure is something us foreigners will never understand unless we spend longer than a month living there. But regardless of where the heart lies, Japan by and large is very polite to outsiders and will often usually cut us Gaijin a break because they believe their society is exceptionally complex and they don't expect anyone who lives outside of it to even remotely understand how it works. While this sort of mentality prevents a lot of unfair expectations from foreigners in Japan, it harkens back to that original idea that I mentioned before, that Japan believes itself to be an insanely unique nation, a complex culture that doesn't think external factors will really change its culture internally, nor does it believe that its culture will change the culture of external nations. And on the most basic level, I kinda understand why a majority of Japan's population may believe this. After all, as one of my old team teachers once told me, quote, "These kids are not going to be doing anything big or international. They are going to be staying in their hometowns and getting simple jobs. They do not need to be told why it is important to learn another language." Yes, this was actually said to me, and yes, by and large, it was kinda true. Because the general of it is true. Seriously, how many people end up leaving their hometown to go work in another country? Not many. But this backyard mentality combined with Japan's centuries of history with isolationism, well, it kinda altogether creates a different brew of international indifference, and to an extent, denial. For example, despite Japan's very high need for imports, I've met more than a few people who truly believe that Japan can be self-sufficient, which, I'm sorry Japan, with the current rate of consumption and aging population, unless there is a massive scaling back in lifestyle, a new way to flatten mountains into farmland, or a huge baby boom, I can't see Japan ever being self-sustaining while maintaining the lifestyle it currently has. But I digress. My point is, despite the modern times, there's just been this hint that a lot of Japan really doesn't believe what it does really affects anything outside its borders and vice versa. And I've heard people in Japan claim this with my own ears. And when it comes to the everyday life of the average individual, this much is true. Heck, it's true for anyone anywhere who isn't following international events. The actions of a farmer in rural Iowa isn't going to reverberate much into the international community. So to be clear, I want to say I understand that every country has its own isolationist mentalities and groups, but I would argue where most of these isolationist behaviors resides in pockets of communities in other parts of the developed world, it's a far more universally accepted concept in Japan as a whole. I cannot help but feel like so much of Japan, when it comes to international matters, suffers greatly specifically because there are still so many people, both civilians and people in government, who believe that Japan's issues are its own in isolation, and it neither affects those outside the country, nor does the outside affect it. It's not that Japan's xenophobic, because xenophobia by definition is, quote, the dislike or prejudice of people from other countries. Japan doesn't dislike or hold prejudice against external countries, because if they did, they wouldn't have a culture of politeness and helpfulness to foreigners who struggle through their complex society. Rather, Japan simply believes that it doesn't affect the outside world, nor does much of the outside world affect it. There is a huge difference between those two things. Now, this concept has kind of worked up to a point. But here's the problem that COVID brought to light when it comes to Japan's mentality of Shimagumi Konjo. Unlike many other island nations that have similar insular beliefs in its culture, Japan is 1. The third greatest economy in the world, with multinational branches of its largest businesses in most of the other developed nations. 2. Contains the population 1/3 the size of the US while being over 26 times smaller than the US. 3. It revolutionized the global entertainment industry through video games and anime. You can cry about weebs all you want, folks, you know it's true. And 4. It purposely initiated and fostered the concept of Cool Japan, starting in 2013 with the establishment of Cool Japan Fund Incorporated in an attempt to gain international attention by making Japan's popular and traditional culture as accessible to the outside world as possible. A sort of soft power that was developed to, quote, indirectly influence behavior or interest through cultural or ideological means. So, I believe I have to ask a very obvious question here. How is it possible that any number of Japan's government members or population can hold on to this notion of not affecting the outside world nor the outside world affecting it, while also creating multinational businesses and using their traditional and popular culture as a way to get the outside world invested in Japan? The short answer is, it can't! Japan, you gotta understand, you absolutely succeeded in everything that you set out to do on a multinational level. You not only got the whole world invested in your companies and products, but you also have multiple generations of people invested into your culture. These were your goals. By doing this, you cannot say that you're an island nation whose society is neither affected by the outside world nor whose culture has affected the outside world coming in, because both of these things have happened. From 2013 to 2019, you have made great efforts to show the world just how cool and interesting you are without realizing what the consequences of that action was going to be. International couples in Japan are on the rise. Academic interest in Japan linguistically, culturally, and economically have been increasing for years now. And the interest of foreign workers seeking out Japan as a place of employment, something you need, by the way, is still huge. Yet you shut your doors to all these people that you invited over the last 9 years just to see how cool you are, to show off how many possibilities there were. Now you've turned 180 degrees and said no to all of us. Never mind the fact that Japanese tourists are still traveling the globe, still just as susceptible to diseases and viruses as much as any other human being, yet the standards and practices of quarantine and prevention used for these tourists are apparently just inapplicable to foreigners. Let me tell you something, alright? We are more than happy to follow the laws and regulations that your sovereign nation has decided to use in order to prevent the spread of COVID. We are more than happy to sit in a hotel for 2 weeks. We are more than okay with having tracking apps on our phones for that time. We are more than willing to pass negative test after negative test and file pages and pages of bureaucratic documents. If it means that we can fulfill our dreams of possibilities that you showed us were possible over 9 freaking years, we will do it. Yet, we're not even allowed the chance. You told us how cool you were, Japan. You spent 9 years telling us how cool it was to invest ourselves in your country. And this is the response we get. This is why we compare Kishida's policies to Sakoku. This is why so many researchers, students, and workers have given up on you and have moved their interest to other countries like Korea. This is why we're angry. You know, I'm really doing a bad job at defending Japan here, aren't I? It just seems like I'm doing the opposite. Well, let me try to turn that around. Remember that statistic I gave for the population who's in favor of Kishida's policies? It was like, what, 89%, right? That's a lot of people. A whole lot. An obvious majority, right? Well, what about that other 11%? What do they think? What would they say to us? And more importantly, what would you say to them? See, I'm sticking with what I said at the beginning of this video. If we're going to consider Japan, we have to consider all of it, even that 11%. Look, hypothetically, let's say that COVID never happened. Let's all say that everything is going as it should have been. Let's say that you got into that study abroad program. Let's say that you got that job working at that Japanese firm. Let's say I got to go over to expand my life's work through a Japanese MCN or some other company. What do you expect will happen? Honestly, ask yourself that question. What do you expect will happen? Do you think you're gonna make a difference? Do you think you're gonna be an amazing grassroots diplomat who will show Japan that foreigners aren't scary or untrustworthy? That we can all live together? That what defines us is not our race or nationality, but the fact we're all part of the great thing called Jindui? Well, I'm sad to say it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way anywhere. It doesn't matter if you're in a foreign exchange student program or the JET program for that matter. It doesn't work that way, especially in Japan. Japan does not change quickly. Sometimes it feels like Japan never changes at all. It is a country completely wrapped up in its own way of life, still believing that despite being a central figure on the international stage, its effects on the outside world are very little, and very little about the outside world affects it. I believe a lot of people in Japan believe this still. How many? I'd say about 89%. But you know, despite my ramblings of anger and what I'm sure a lot of people are going to accuse me as foreign entitlement, I still stand with Japan. I still plan to return. I still hope that when all of this is under control, I'll still be relevant and interesting enough for a company in Japan to want to pick me up, help me get a visa, and allow me to continue to teach about the culture of the country I love. Because there's still 11%. There are 11% of people who understand that the situation isn't black and white, that families are being ripped apart, that people are losing their jobs, that the lofty goals that people have worked hard for are now withheld from them with no further explanation. When I was in the JET program teaching and grassroots diplomating abroad, I didn't make a difference in a ton of people in Japan. Heck, I don't think I made much of a difference to the majority of the people in my own hometown. But there were a few that I did. I was able to foster a unique multinational relationship and understanding with a humble family-owned bar that shared my love of one of the greatest anime franchises of all time. And I was able to share and explain the history of how that franchise that they so dearly loved was also loved by a huge group of people from my country. I was able to build an understanding and trust with a student who, at this point in time, likely is not involved with the international community at all, but likely is far more comfortable around other foreigners because he trusted me enough to tell me a lewd schoolyard joke that only schoolyard kids would find funny. I was able to give a bunch of Yankee kids, students that a lot of people have already given up on, the opportunity to enjoy learning because I provided them an atmosphere and an educational setting where they could try, fail, and try again until they got it right. A complete contradiction to the Japanese sociological norm of students being pressured to always be right in the classroom, even if it's their first time trying. I was able to get 2 junior high kids to let down their guard, to let go of the tatemae wall that Japan implores its people to have in order to keep its population in harmony and conflict-free, so they could be relaxed enough to just freaking talk to me as themselves, to even make fun of me and poke at my belly, saying that I was kinda chubby. Something that moments ago would be the last thing on their minds. But instead, they told me how their game went. They asked where I was from, and they waved for me from the passenger side window of their parents' van. Despite how grandiose I attempt to make these things sound, on paper, in reality, they're few and far between and kinda small. Kinda rare. How small and how rare? Well, I'd say I make up about 11% of my time I spent in Japan. But despite these things being so small and rare, they are the greatest, most defining events that happened in my ongoing career of being a cultural bridge. So, now I ask all of you who are watching, is 11% worth it? Is 11% worth your time and energy to put up with problems and misunderstandings and insanely annoying situations that seem to make zero sense at the time? Is 11% worthy of the months and months, if not years, of language and cultural study? Is 11% worth the suffering? I think it is. I think that even if my contribution to international understanding in Japan only adds to that 11% by just 0.0000001%, it'll all have been worth it. Because I've seen firsthand how much that 0.0000001 actually makes. I've seen how much it matters to the lives of just the small handfuls of people I've been able to reach out to is. So, what will you decide?